Hey, I'm Mike. I want to build a second side table for our chaise lounges. So what I'm going to do is take this old pot we haven't used for a few years and turn it into a side table. And the way I'll do that is I'm going to cut out a piece of plywood that fits on the inside and a second piece that covers out to the outside edge and glue them together. And I'm going to rot out an area in the center and put some nice looking copper colored tiles in there. And then I'm going to paint the wood parts with a high gloss brown that matches this color. Now a couple of challenges. First, this is an oval shape and it's sloped in a bit, so it's going to take some freehand carving and sanding to get it to fit well. And second, taking a piece of plywood and turning it into a high gloss finish is a little tricky. High gloss will show every last flaw. So I'm going to use a sequence of products and put a fair amount of work into achieving the finish I'm looking for. I'll start by gluing up a piece of 3/4 inch and 1/4 inch plywood so that once I cut out the discs and glue them together, I'll have 2 inches of wood depth. That should be enough to accommodate the tile and the backer board as well as the glue and the mortar. Now I'm going to cut out the ovals for the project. I have this router jig for cutting circles and ovals, but unfortunately it won't work to cut the ovals in this case because when the major and minor axes are too close in size together, these two parts that slide back and forth bump into each other and it doesn't work. In my case, they're only about 1/4 inch difference between those two dimensions. So instead, I'm going to cut out circles slightly larger than I need using the jig. Then I'll mark the ovals and remove the extra wood to turn them into ovals using a combination of different tools. The first step is I'm going to screw the pieces of wood down onto this block so that I can clamp it in place in the woodworking vise to avoid damaging the bench when I make the cuts. Now I need to glue the two ovals together, making sure that they align with the oval shapes in the pot. For the first step, I'm going to put some blue tape around the edge of the small oval to compensate for the fact that I purposely made that oval a little too small to leave room inside the pot for paint. Next, I'll apply some hot glue over the top as a temporary glue, and I'll put the larger oval in the correct orientation, press it down, take them out of there, mark where they line up, separate them and remove the hot glue, and then glue it together permanently with wood glue. Finally, I'll apply some caulk in any gaps that were left from gluing them together. Now I'm going to use the router with a 1/8 inch radius roundover bit to soften the top edge of the table. Now I need to remove some wood from the center of the table where the tile will go. I'll start by using the circle cutting jig to cut one circle that's about 7/8 of an inch diameter, less than the size of the table, and then I'll route it down to the depth I need for the tile and backer board. Then I'll move it in and make one slightly smaller circle, and then that'll be it for this jig. It can only go down to about 9-inch diameter of circle. After that, I'll have to use a different technique to remove the rest of the wood. To remove the rest of the wood I need to make room for the tile, I'll switch to a jig that I built. It's a steel plate where I've welded on a flat bar in a position such that when I rest the back edge of the router against it and use it as a reference edge, it causes the bit to protrude just past the front edge. I can then clamp the jig down onto the table and make a series of routing passes where in each pass I remove all the wood between the two sides of the circle that I had cut. I'll then plunge down a little deeper and repeat that until I get to the depth I want. Then I'll unclamp the jig, move it back, and repeat until I've removed all the wood that I need. Well, now I have a circular area of wood cleared away for the tile that sits inside of an oval-shaped table. So it looks a little funny because the width of the table edge varies by about 1/4 inch from one side to the other. So to fix that, I made this little tool. It's just a piece of wood with a couple of nails going through it, one going all the way down, the other one just barely protruding. And what I'll do is I'll rest this one nail against the outside edge of the table and use it to scribe a parallel line all the way around. And that will mark where I need to remove some wood to turn the inside area into an oval. To remove the wood in the area marked by that oval, I'm going to use an angle grinder with a wood carving attachment and then just use freehand to remove the wood that I need. I'll then clean up those cuts with an angle die grinder with a wood sanding drum, and then I'm going to switch to using this burr. This is actually a metal cutting tool, and the reason I'm going to use it is it gives me a real straight line that I can use to try to achieve a real perpendicular edge. Now I need to fill the plywood voids and fix any other flaws. I'll do some of this work on the underside of the piece that fits down inside the pot, but because that part won't be visible, I'll mostly just focus on fit there. I'll put a lot more effort into the upper side that is visible. I'm going to start by using this product called Formula 27. This is like Bondo, but it cures off white instead of blue, so it paints over a little more easily, and also it goes on a little more smoothly than Bondo does. I'm going to apply it using this painter's knife spatula so I can really get in there and do some detail work and try to fill every last flaw. Once that cures, I'll use some chisel work to reach a shape that I'm looking for before I start sanding. Now it's time to sand the piece. I'll start by using the oscillating spindle sander to get the outside faces, and then I'll move on to use the random orbit sander to get the remaining faces, and then I'll move to using this polisher. Finally, I'll do quite a bit of hand sanding. Now I'm going to apply the grain filler. This is a product that was designed for use with woodworking projects. For example, a while back I built a bar out of red walnut. I used this to fill the wood pores. I then stained it and applied a polyurethane finish. In the current case, I'm painting instead of staining, but the goal is the same. I want it to be that you won't see any of the wood grain through the finish. Now, the first step is to use a reducer to thin it down to the consistency of like a thick clay slurry, and then you use this flexible paddle to try to push the product down everywhere you can into the pores. You then wipe off the extra with a clean cloth, and after it dries, do a light sanding. I'm going to use a 600 grit sandpaper. Now I need to cut out a piece of cement backer board that will fit down in the table, onto which I'll later apply the tile and then glue the backer board down into the table. The first step is I'll use a piece of paper to transfer the dimensions of the oval onto here. Next, I'll use the angle grinder with a masonry cutoff wheel to cut out the oval, and then a masonry grinding wheel to clean up the edges. Now, I always wear personal protective equipment when I work with power tools. I just want to point out that cutting and grinding concrete backer board produces a particularly toxic dust you don't want to breathe, so I'm going to be wearing my full face mask with P100 particulate filters. Now I'm ready to paint the table. I'll apply the paint and polyurethane finish using a paint sprayer, and I'll do both steps without the tile in place. The first step is I'm going to use some blue painter's tape to mask off the area in the center so that I'll have a clean area to glue the backer board and tile in place after I've applied the finishes. I'll apply one coat of this gray primer paint and then 3 coats of the color paint that I got from the local paint store that they matched against that brown color on the pot using a color scanning computer. Well, after 3 coats of spray paint, I noticed there were still some visible flaws in the paint job, so I went back over and applied some more of that Formula 27, and then I sanded it down with that 600 grit sandpaper, and then I took some acetone on a rag and just really lightly went over it to just smooth it over, being careful not to take too much off. Acetone will just eat all that stuff away, including the latex-based paint. So now I'm going to do one last paint job, and hopefully it's good enough to then move on to doing the polyurethane. That additional patching and painting pass resulted in a much better finish. Now I'm ready to apply the polyurethane finish. I'm going to use this Varathane oil-based high gloss finish because I think it'll be somewhat more resilient to the weather than a water-based finish would be. That means I need to be extra sure that the latex-based paint is completely cured before I apply this finish. I did a fair amount of experimentation with this finish, and I found it somewhat challenging to get it to come out as clear and shiny as I want. For one thing, the instructions on the side of the can said to wait 3 hours between coats, but I found that wasn't enough. When I did that, I ended up with a bubbly finish, which happens because the previous coat's still outgassing at the time you apply the finish. So instead, I let it cure for overnight between coats. Also, typically when I apply polyurethane finishes, I use a 320 grit sanding sponge to knock down any sharp points and just clean it up and get it ready for the next coat. But I found when I did that with this finish, it ended up somewhat scratchy and cloudy looking. So instead what I found worked was a sequence of first 600 grit, then 2000 grit, and finally burnishing it down with a clean white cloth. fair amount of work, but it results in a superior finish. Finally, strain the product before the first coat and thin with mineral spirits before each coat. Now I'm ready to start on the tiling. I need to cut this piece to fit the backer board, and unfortunately, as you can see, it's not quite big enough to fit over all the edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it on the back and trace it out, and then I'm going to trace out the places where I need to fill in with smaller pieces of tile around there. I'll first transfer the dimensions from the backer board onto the tile with a marker, and then I'll cut out the tile pieces with this nipper and clean up the edges with this sanding stone. Now I'm ready to install the backer board. I would typically use subflooring adhesive, but that requires a layer of about 3/8 thickness of the adhesive, and I didn't want to have to remove that much more wood from the center of the table. I worried that would weaken the table too much. Instead, I'm going to use a marine epoxy. Now, you don't normally want to epoxy a backer board in place because you want it to have some flexibility from the subflooring adhesive to accommodate movement of the foundation and people walking around on top of the tile, but neither one of those things are going to happen here, so the epoxy should work fine for this case. Laying those pre-cut tile pieces down onto the backer board, I can see there's places where it doesn't quite fit right. So I'm going to go back and recut some pieces from the leftover tile and also sand around the edges of various pieces to try to get the whole thing to fit well. After quite a bit of cutting and sanding, I got the edge of the tile to fit up pretty nicely to the edge of the table. You can see some places here where there's tiles missing, but I have those extra tiles here, and I'll just add them later when I do the tiling. Now, one thing that didn't come out quite where I wanted is the edge of the tile is a little too low. The thin set will raise it up a little bit, but not enough to bring it up to where I want it. I'd like to get ideally even with the edge of the table. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'll put down a first layer of thin set to raise the height, and then after that cures, I'll tile over the top of it. To get to the right thickness for that first layer of thin set, I'm going to use this little tool I just built. The bottom piece of wood is the thickness of the tile plus thin set that I need to leave room for, and the top piece is a reference edge. So I'll put the thin set onto the backer board and push it in place, and then I use this tool to set on top here and just kind of slice off the extra. Before I apply the thin set, I'm going to put down some latex additive to give it a little bit more bonding strength. And finally, after I apply it, I'm going to use this other little tool I built. It's just a block of wood with some brad nails protruding from it. And I'll use it to score some marks in there to, again, increase the adhesion. I need a way to clamp the table in place while I'm applying the mortar and grout. And I don't want to use the woodworking bench like I've been using so far because I don't want to get those materials on my bench. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of plywood and lay the table out on there and mark the edges and cut them out roughly on the bandsaw. And then I'll use that as a clamp with some clamps holding it down to my funky old card table over there. Well, I finished getting the tile in. I'm pretty happy with how it came out. So now it's time to put in the grout. I'm going to use this unsanded gray grout. Originally I was going to use a white grout because I think it would have looked nice, but I think the gray will blend in better with whatever mortar has popped up past the tile on there, and it'll look good. After completing the mortar and grout work and then removing the masking tape, I can see there's a little bit of sticky residue left as well as some minor scratches. So I'm going to apply some of this deluxing compound, which contains a combination of buffing compounds and waxes, and I find it works really well for fixing problems like that. So the project's done. Here it is. Let's try it out. Cheers. I also got this cover built for the table. It's built by a company I found called Covers and All. You just pick out the shape you want and send them the dimensions and they'll custom build it for you. I've used it a few times for other pieces of furniture and I found it provides good protection against sun and rain and birds. And they charge a pretty reasonable amount, depends on how big the piece is, but for this was only like 12 bucks. And finally, after a couple of weeks, I'm going to apply this grout sealant. This will protect against if someone spilled some wine or something else that might stain the table. So that's it. Thanks again for watching.